work in that area. So if you'd like to ask me about that, that's fine. So really in areas that aren't traditional narrative areas, but are more business related, with some examples of my work and other people's work, and some thoughts on how you might want to use it yourselves in your practice. So, stories. This is probably a familiar setup to most people in this room, that you will have grown up with stories being read to you, and maybe at home, hopefully at home, and at school as well, and you get used to the concept of what a story is. And it's very much a part of our psychology, if you like, the idea of a story or narrative, very much a part of who people are. And people sometimes say, well, music is really intrinsic to me. But if we think about it, narrative is even more intrinsic. And you could say that music is a division of narrative, if you like. So it really does define who we are. And right from early days, in every culture across the globe, we use story, we use narrative. And I'm putting this slide up to see how many people in the room know what that means. Get an immediate image of a story from just one visual. Yes. That's how deeply set it is. So if you grew up in the UK or a Western culture, it's very likely that you, as these people have, will immediately know that this is Snow White's hand, and she's just been poisoned by the evil stepmother's poisoned apple. You know, we just have it within us. And if you grew up in a different culture, you'll have different stories that will do that for you as well. And then today, as adults, and as we go on in life, we still have stories around us. We still tell stories, listen to stories, meet with our friends and chat. We gossip maybe, it's a form of storytelling. It's just around us everywhere. Today has been a story. Today is continuing as a story. So I'm going to introduce myself a little later than the beginning of the session with my professional story. I work as a freelance writer and lecturer. I've previously worked in publishing, that was back in the 80s in London, in sales. I set up a community enterprise working in drug and alcohol rehabs with creative writing, helping people in distress to find their creativity again, and many other fields. Part of the work I currently do is with Imperial College London and the Royal College of Art, and they have a double master's programme, a very intensive 2-year master's programme, and I do some tutoring on that in narrative, design narrative. I've published 13 books, I've written quite a lot of journalism, I also publish my poetry, and I'm working on, as everyone in this room is, working on their novel. I've also qualified and worked as a writing therapist, and that's the side of it I'm not going to talk about, so that's more the personal psychology, as I mentioned, storytelling our lives, which can be used therapeutically for people in distress to understand themselves and where they are and where they're going. And so this is my story, but my story hasn't ended. At least I hope my story hasn't ended. You know, I'm standing here at the age of something or other, and I hope I've got another 20, 30, 40 years. The Snow White story, we know, had a beginning, a middle, and an end. We know that end. My personal or my professional story, I don't know what it is. I don't want to tempt fate by saying what might happen when I walk out to catch a bus, but we really don't know, do we? And that is where the potential for using narrative comes in, when it comes that we can actually take an unfinished story and think about how we might finish it, how we might rewrite it. So that slide illustrates what I've just said. And this is just one aspect of narrative. There are so many, you know, I could talk forever about it, and I'm sure you have other areas as well. But this is what I'm talking about today, that we can be in this creative space where we don't know the ending, we can write the ending. So just to backtrack a little bit, what is narrative? Well, a narrative describes a structure of events, and you can say it's the architecture of a story, and you can liken it, the metaphor, if you like, is that it's like the design of a building. And the difference between narrative and story is that the story takes place within the building. You can go into the building through any door and take any route, and you can tell a story in any time. You can chop up time and go in. It doesn't have to be linear. The narrative is set, the story can be changed, and it can be likened to a tour through the narrative building. But for practical purposes, in the ways I'm using it, and you may want to use it, really we can interchange those two terms. So story or narrative doesn't really matter in this process. So in storytelling and fiction and film, a story, as I'm sure is obvious to you, is a sequence of events involving characters in a setting. So character, we know what a character is. It's a fictional person or an animal perhaps, or an animated person of some sort. We can change that when we're using narrative as a tool to be something else, a symbol, temperature for instance, or the elements of a project brief. So we can take our characters and substitute whatever we want for the characters and write a story about them. I'll give you an example. My children get very grumpy in the winter in our kitchen because it's so cold. So if I was to develop a story to sort of see what's happening there, I might use these characters. Character A would be 0 degrees, freezing point. B, 20 degrees. Character C, absolute 0. You could put in some emotions as characters, and of course the people as characters. Put my children in, put myself in. And then write the story and see, perhaps do it around the table together, verbally tell the story of these characters and see how they are feeling. The people are feeling, the children are feeling, and see what happens. So that's one of many ways of playing with narrative. But whatever you do with it, narrative moves on over time. It's not static, and that's very important really. It's never a snapshot. It may not be, doesn't have to be linear, as in the story, you can go in any route, but it has to have that temporal nature. It has to move on over time. So I just wonder if you read that and just think about it. And I think it's very easy to see the work that we do and our interactions in terms of snapshots rather than an ongoing process. And one of the benefits of writing narratives around things is that we see that it's moving on all the time. I'd like you to do a bit of work now, please. I'd like you to write your own story. There's a bowl of olives there in a pot. And if I gave you 30 seconds, maybe a minute, to just on a piece of paper, just write in bullet points what happens to these olives. And I won't ask you to see them. Nobody never needs to see this, so feel free to write whatever you like. Just a few more seconds to finish off. Okay, so we'll come back to this later and I'll send you home with a bit of homework with it at the end. I just want to touch on where these ideas come from when we're writing stories. And I was presenting here last year and I gave a session called Creative Visualization and talked a lot about the unconscious mind and where ideas come from. And you are in absolutely the wrong place, the wrong setting to be writing stories. If we're going to get ideas coming up from our unconscious mind, and I don't believe they come from aliens or anything spiritual, they're all in there somewhere, we need to put ourselves in the right setting. So everything I'm talking about in this presentation this year, please do bear in mind that this is a very business-like way of doing it, and in practice we wouldn't be doing workshops like this, we'd be doing it in quite a different way. So some people say, but I'm not creative. Now, I can't imagine any of you here today saying that because of the context we're in today. So just a few quick questions to make you think about how creative you might be. So if I asked you to write, and when I say write, you could say speak it or draw it or code it or something like that. Your life story on this piece of parchment, what would you write? And I'm guessing that everybody here would be able to do that without any trouble. So how about if I asked you to write your work story, your CV essentially, your resume? I'm imagining that you would be able to do that quite easily. If I asked you to write your business's story, or if you're in education, perhaps your university's story, or in whatever context, what would you write there? You might have to do more research, but you'd be able to do it quite simply, I would say. If I asked you to write the story of the future of your business on this piece of parchment, what would you write? And that's only an extension of what you've already written. But that's where we're starting to get into imagination, and that's where the unconscious mind and the relaxation that I'll talk about a bit in a minute come in. So, here are some thoughts from people who use narrative in their work, and I've started with people in the digital industries because there's some sort of sponsorship, isn't there? Some of you might be in there. So I'll just leave you to read these slides quickly. So it seems obvious that she's going to be using narrative because her output includes narratives. That's quite intuitive to us, isn't it? Quite understandable. In social software. And again, we think of social websites and the social media as carrying our life narratives. That seems quite obvious, and you can understand why they use narrative in that context. How about governance, the driest occupation on earth? So people are thinking that there is a place for narrative within some of these areas where we wouldn't normally put them. Organisation research. And these last two are by academics, so the previous slide and this slide. So I don't know to what extent an organisation would use narrative in their governance, but hey, why not? And then I'm going to just talk briefly about a couple of projects I've worked on. There's me. And here there were about 30 or 40 design students in Beijing, and they were product design students, and I was doing a workshop with them, an intensive module on producing new designs and using narrative in this way. First of all, we asked them to reverse engineer an ordinary household product, and that was a humidifier, and then to put the elements on a piece of paper and label them. And we brought in some engineers to help them because the product design students were mostly arts students and didn't really know what a screwdriver was, but they managed, they were fine. And then I asked them to take one component, just at random really, and put it into a story, build a story around it. So they had something tactile in their hands, and they were working in groups, and to imagine it in a different context. And this particular group, they've got somebody in outer space, and there's something about a genie. I can't quite work out what they were doing exactly, but they were traveling through space. They'd disassembled a fan, a table fan, and this person in space was trying to get home. I think they were trying to use the fan to propel a spaceship. Anyway, they were doing a lovely narrative. That was great. And then got them to actually play with these components, including, you can see the propeller there, and giving them other materials, and to get a sense of it, a tactile sense of it within their narrative, so that it's still a spaceship wandering around. And then, with the use of crits and lots of peer and tutor feedback, bringing it back to Earth. So how could you actually use this amazing machine? We can't use it in space. Well, what they decided to do was that they made it into a flying lamp, and you have it in your living room, and you have several plates on the walls and table in your living room, and every 24 hours this lamp relocates, so you get home from work and the lighting is different. And if you sit in your chair and there's not enough light, you can clap your hands and it'll come to you. So they would never have come to that product or potential product unless they had been drawing this storyboard and using narrative. So that's one example of how useful it can be in a domain that you wouldn't think would take narrative. And then another aspect of my work, these are library slides because there's a certain sensitivity around commercial branding. Anyway, there's lovely, clean, squeaky people. I work within SMEs sometimes when I'm invited in to just do workshops with them, really, to get ideas for branding. And we might start with a warm-up that used to be called word ball, that you said a word when you threw the ball to somebody, but now you have to say a line of a story, which is impossible, so people relax and laugh, and that's good. I was told earlier today we're not supposed to use the word brainstorming, so we'll do some thought showering with some of the outputs. The bean bags, our keynote speaker before lunch didn't like bean bags. I stand here in defence of bean bags. In fact, I have bean bags at home. And part of the process is to actually relax enough to let ideas come in the context that you've already given it. If you wandered out now, you probably wouldn't have a great idea about the branding for that SME that I'm working with. But if you work with the SME, you've got the context, you've done the word ball, you've done some thought showering, then when you relax, probably some of the ideas coming up might be useful and relevant. And as I mentioned before, you don't have to write your ideas, you might want to draw your ideas. And a lot of group work, splitting up, coming back together again, sharing ideas. Another group with your raw ideas will see them differently and will take them in a different direction. And then you get all sorts of ideas at the end of it, and then the client can either choose to take those ideas away as they are or can work further on them. So, olives. Did anyone do some bullet point storying? Yes. I'm not going to ask you to take this work any further now because, as I say, I'd rather you're on bean bags with subdued lighting. And if you're going to take a train home and you're going to relax, maybe do something there. But the idea is that you take your bullet point story and think of different settings for it. So you might think about your career, your family, your workplace, your enterprise, whatever feels appropriate. And it might be worth your while writing a few of those ideas down and doing it in different contexts. So you might have a list of various places you could transpose your olive story to. And then you want to replace the olives with characters or people or things within that setting. So at work it might be some of your colleagues, or it might be a particular problem you've got. And then tell that same story. And I hope none of your olives exploded. Oh no. You've eaten them? Oh dear. This may or may not work for you, but I'm trying to get across the idea that you can play with narratives, that you can put it in different contexts, that you can have fun with it, and that you can come out with a completely different result from the one that your mind thought you were going to get at the beginning. I hadn't thought about you eating them, I must say. And then at the bottom I said, try rewriting your story in one sentence, because that's what we need to do. We need to be able to pitch, don't we? I was talking to someone earlier about pitching, using narrative as pitching. And not only as individuals or as salespeople within organisations, but organisations themselves need to pitch. They need a narrative. And often one sentence is all the time you get. You know, I could have stood up here and be told I had 20 minutes and then it was cut off after a minute. You know, we've got to know how to present enough to keep somebody interested. So that's all around narrative as well. So why not try rewriting it in one sentence and see what happens? And I rather like the Inuit quote here. It's a bit soft and soppy, I know, it might be a bit much for some of you. So I'll finish with the paper that summarises the work in Beijing that I showed you about, which is going to a conference in Dublin in September. And if you would like to have a copy, I'm very happy to email it to you. I have cards at the front if I didn't hand you one, so my email is on that and you're welcome to take one. And any dialogue would be welcome. And that's it for now.